A quick aside before the start of the video, down in the description below, I have my 2024 audience survey linked, and I use that survey to determine what kinds of videos I should make and what business decisions I should make for the coming year. And so if you are a regular viewer and you haven't filled out that survey yet, I'd appreciate it if you took the time to do so after watching this video. So with that out of the way, let's get started. In the aftermath of World War II, the US would become far more militarily active around the world. The lesson they took from the interwar years was that a fear of confronting aggression only led to more aggression, and eventually a much bigger war. Had they been willing to confront Hitler earlier, they could have avoided the bloodshed and destruction of another world war. These lessons were on the minds of George F. Kennedy when he wrote his long telegram calling for the containment of the Soviet Union, and on the mind of President Truman when he inaugurated the Truman Doctrine by arming anti-communist forces in Greece and Turkey. This policy would lead America into the Korean War and eventually to Vietnam. Despite the Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower administration's general opposition to continued European colonialism, they came to believe that the process of decolonization would create numerous opportunities for Soviet aggression, and thus couldn't simply allow them to have free reign over these places. So the US would support the anti-communist regime set up in the South and would spend the next 19 years gradually building up its support. Initially in the form of money, arms, and advisors, and eventually escalating to active combat troops on the ground and bombing neighboring countries. A peace agreement was eventually signed in Paris in January 1973, which saw then President Richard Nixon declare victory with honor. The United States will continue to recognize the government of the Republic of Vietnam as the sole legitimate government of South Vietnam. We shall continue to aid South Vietnam within the terms of the agreement, and we shall support efforts by the people of South Vietnam to settle their problems peacefully. Over 26,000 North Vietnamese prisoners were released from the South, while the North released 4,600 South Vietnamese soldiers and nearly 600 Americans, including future U.S. Senator John McCain. Despite this, Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger believed that it was only a matter of time before the South fell. Nixon's only concern was that Saigon didn't fall before the 1974 midterms, making it a kind of Shakespearean irony that his presidency would end before either. Gerald Ford would try to reassure America's allies in Asia. To our allies and friends in Asia, I pledge a continuity in our support for their security, independence, and economic development. But in June of 1973, while he was still the House Minority Leader, Gerald Ford introduced a bill prohibiting U.S. combat activity in Vietnam, which passed 278 to 124 in the House and 64 to 26 in the Senate, with Nixon signing another bill, the Case-Church Amendment, that further restricted military operations in the rest of Southeast Asia. And shortly after resigning, a Senate subcommittee voted to cut over $5 billion from the 1975 defense budget and rejected a request for $2 billion in military and economic aid from Saigon, passing the Foreign Assistance Act of 1974, which reduced economic aid to South Vietnam and Cambodia. There was only a brief pause in the fighting between North and South after the Paris Accords, just long enough for the US to pull its forces out. Although the South's military was in bad shape prior to the final push on Saigon, the North was in pretty rough shape as well. The economy of the North had been in shambles for over a decade, and had become dependent on importing food from other communist countries to feed itself. The People's Army of Vietnam had severe logistics problems, and in order to sustain their war against the South, they had to place much of the government's civilian ministries under military control. Hanoi was initially concerned about how the US might react to an all-out attack, but by 1975 America's attention was firmly on the Middle East thanks to the Yom Kippur War and the OPEC oil embargo. Additionally, in January 1975, President Ford said there weren't any circumstances he could see that would lead him to sending troops back to Vietnam. And in February, Congress would reject another aid request from Saigon. When the final push began in March, the People's Army would push toward major population centers and cut off their supply lines. Saigon would fall much quicker than expected, which left the army in charge of administering the territory, as well as implementing economic reforms and the re-education camps. Despite nobody in the Ford administration actively advocating for sending troops back into Vietnam, a blame game would erupt amongst former and current members of the administration. Nixon would blame Congress for Saigon's fall, despite having signed much of the legislation that doomed it to fall in the first place. Kissinger would lament over how the collapse would make the US look weak and unreliable, but evidence from the Paris peace talks would reveal that he knew the entire time that the accords were insufficient to secure the South. The fall was seen as a collapse of the Truman Doctrine and the post-World War II order. The blow to American idealism which the protracted brutalities of the involvement occasioned, the damage which military and political failure in Vietnam may have done to American influence, are only aspects of a larger process of change, and the new structure of power relations in the world would not, in my view, be radically different if the United States had never become seriously involved in Indochina. The belief that prevailed for nearly a generation, not only that American policy was all determinate in molding the map of the world, but that the United States had a greater degree of choice at any point in time than was in reality the case. And you can be determinate in this channel's future by supporting it on Patreon. Patreon is a crowdfunding platform that allows viewers to support content creators monetarily on a monthly basis at a degree that they're comfortable with. Members of my Patreon get access to a number of perks, such as early access to all the videos I make, ones that are also free of ads and plugs such as this. You could also get your name and the scrolling chyron at the end screen, as well as access to the notes and scripts I use to make these videos. And you can get a discount on your Patreon membership if you sign up for an annual membership instead. But at the end of the day, all of these perks we offer are ultimately just ways for us creators to show our appreciation, because most people who sign up for Patreon are people who just believe in what we're doing and want to help us create more and see us do it for longer. And so for all the patrons, past, present, and future, thank you. But for now, let's get back to the history. But while the Americans were navel-gazing, the communists would have their way with South Vietnam. As Northern soldiers patrolled the newly captured Saigon, they were frequently reminded through loudspeakers across the city to not fraternize with the Southerners, while army leaders and party cadres maneuvered and backstabbed each other in order to procure for themselves the unknown riches of the South. Communists of all ranks wandered into homes, removing anything that took their fancy. Northerners treated Southerners, especially those who could be branded lackeys of the fallen regime, as milch cows, providers of spoils. The Soviets took their own modest share in kind, 10,000 M16 rifles and 10 million rounds of ammunition. People who had fled from northern Vietnam back in 1954 hid for longer than their native southern neighbors, fearing that the punishment for them would be worse. Families that had been separated since 1954 would bring bags of rice and sugar when visiting their families in the South, having been fed propaganda that the South was in a state of imperialist-induced famine, worse than they were experiencing, only to discover that the Southerners were better fed than they were. At least for the moment. The US evacuation would leave thousands of US allies behind to a grisly fate. For months there were sporadic murders and massacres by Viet Cong of Southern civilians, having been labeled collaborators, and many Southerners would choose to commit suicide rather than subject themselves to public humiliation and torture. South Vietnam's military cemetery would be vandalized and had a sign placed outside its gates saying, "Here lie the Americans' puppet soldiers who have paid the price for their crimes." Most Southern institutions would be shut down, including universities, which would be reopened months later with their syllabi radically altered. But more famous was the construction of the re-education camps. Hundreds of thousands of Southerners would be sent to the camps, with members of the former Southern government given especially cruel stays. High-ranking members of the military, such as General Lee Mindau, would be held in prison until the early 90s. Soldiers of all ranks, both in administrative and combat roles, with party cadres usually inducing the information of their whereabouts from their neighbors. These soldiers would then be made to wait weeks before receiving new instructions, which were usually followed by orders to report to a former government building, having been told to only bring enough food or money for a month, leaving many to believe that their re-education process would only last that long. They would be made to fill out questionnaires about their service and write letters and affidavits confessing to crimes, real or otherwise, until the party cadres were satisfied. They would be spontaneously moved from camp to camp in the middle of the night, with the windows of buses and trucks blacked out. Their days at the camps were filled with manual labor in the mornings and lectures in the evenings. They used the prison labor to rebuild formerly abandoned or damaged prisons, while the supply of food gradually shrank, all the while they were used to labor in the rice fields. Medical equipment had been stolen from hospitals in the South, and when these imprisoned soldiers were ill, the doctors at the camps were either incapable or unwilling to treat them. We must now realize that labor will be a necessary part of the remaining days of our lives. We would have to work much harder, for only by labor could we cleanse and improve ourselves. The lectures in the evening consisted of analyzing literature and newspaper headlines, along with criticism and struggle sessions, where prisoners are forced to analyze how every part of their behavior and life is due to anti-revolutionary propaganda, and thus try to instill a sense of self-hatred. At random, prisoners would be accused of conspiring with anti-revolutionary groups and dragged off to unknown fates. And just because you avoided the re-education camps doesn't mean you avoided persecution, especially if you are an ethnic minority. Like much of Southeast Asia, Vietnam had a sizable ethnic Chinese minority, referred to as the Viet Hoa, and Vietnam has its own complicated history with China, leading to ethnic tensions between the two. The ethnic Chinese of South Vietnam, centered in cities like Cho Lan, were one of the driving forces of the economy. Because of this, when the North's economic reforms were implemented, they took on an informal racial dynamic, with the Viet Hoa being disproportionately impacted. Chinese language publications were suppressed, with the Chinese language banned from schools. And ethnic Chinese living along the border with China were forced to either renounce their Chinese citizenship or be subject to heavier taxation. And the treatment of Chinese in Vietnam would fluctuate with tensions between the two governments. This resulted in most of the refugees fleeing Vietnam, especially in the early years, being ethnic Chinese rather than Vietnamese. Indochina is bleeding. Vietnam, Laos, Kampuchea discharged a massive flow of apparently permanent refugees on a scale that the world has not experienced since World War II. No end is in sight to the flow, nor is any political solution visible. Refugees fled by sea. The Viet Hoa would seek refuge in countries with sizable Chinese diasporas such as Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia, and some going as far as Hong Kong and Taiwan. However, many who had fled would be deported back, due to them carrying the passport of the defunct South Vietnam. In 1978 alone, over 100,000 people would flee Vietnam to neighboring Southeast Asian countries, with another 200,000 fleeing to China, with 85% being Viet Hoa. Most of the immigration was illegal, but the government in Hanoi, desperate for cash, would allow people to leave legally, so long as they paid the Vietnamese government $3,000. Over 800,000 people would leave Vietnam between 1975 and 1980, fleeing persecution and/or famine. One of these refugees, Nguyen Quang Ho, had been an anti-war activist in South Vietnam. I am very regretful that I did not understand the communists before. The communists always speak in lofty terms that appeal to the better part of people. Then they are used for a tragic end. I believed them. I was wrong. One of the more under-discussed aspects of post-war Vietnam was resistance to communist rule, and although it was ultimately ineffectual, it did in fact happen, and I think it's worth taking a brief look at. After the war, many families were sent to prisons and re-education camps, including the families of Northern soldiers and Viet Cong. The families of soldiers sent to the camps were banned from finding long-term employment, meaning they were always in constant search of new work, and thus were often forced into the black market. Some Southern soldiers that evaded capture after the fall of Saigon would continue to resist the People's Army in small pockets across the South. Some receiving aid from Pol Pot's Cambodia or training in bases in Thailand, which continued into the 1980s. They mostly operated out of the Nang Trong, Phuoc Tuy, and Vinh Long provinces along the Cambodian border. The mountainous regions of Vietnam saw a lot of anti-communist resistance amongst the local tribes, who were loosely organized as the United Front for the Liberation of Oppressed Races, or FULRO, who would receive support from Cambodia and China. Hanoi also encountered resistance from religious groups. Catholic communities tended to practice passive resistance in the form of non-cooperation, and mostly in Catholic population centers north of Saigon, Vinh Binh, Vinh Ong, and Hue, along with the Hao Hao Buddhist sect in the mountains of Chao Doc, Kiên Giang, An Giang, and Kien Phuong provinces. By the mid-80s, about 60% of Vietnamese troops were deployed to the highlands fighting FULRO and the Montagnards. Anti-Hanoi guerrillas would number about 15,000 in 1977, and about 25,000 in 1983. Many of these groups would claim to be led by one or another general from the Southern Army, despite most of them having fled the country in 1975. They mostly targeted re-education camps, remote military installations, and government offices in the cities. They also ran clandestine radio stations in the highlands and the Mekong Delta, as well as distributing leaflets and tagging buildings with anti-communist graffiti. In order to deter these resistance attacks, the army would quarter troops in civilian homes, functionally using them as human shields. South Vietnam wasn't immediately annexed by North Vietnam after the fall of Saigon. They first established a provisional government that would do the work of incorporating the South's governance and economic system into that of the North. Formal reunification was completed on July 2, 1976, changing the country's name from the Democratic Republic of Vietnam to the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. They also renamed Saigon to Ho Chi Minh City and named Hanoi the capital of the newly unified country. However, just because the South was now formally integrated with the North doesn't mean the Southerners were free from Northern discriminations. The Hanoi Communist Party concentrated power into the hands of corrupt and incompetent bureaucrats and brutal security organizations. At least under Diem and Thieu, there was honor among thieves, but these party people are wolfing down everything in sight. Was it really such a good idea to throw out the Americans? The military of North Vietnam, called the People's Army of Vietnam, would begin its own restructuring in the summer of 1975 in order to adapt to their new role of running re-education camps and hunting down anti-communist resistance. This involved the numerous paramilitary factions of the Viet Cong also getting fully incorporated into the regular army. In the beginning, the army had to implement new disciplinary measures due to soldiers deserting or going AWOL while in the South, due to the riches that had not yet been fully appropriated by the North. A common punishment for disobedient soldiers was to be sent to the Cambodian border to fight the Khmer Rouge raiders. Additionally, there were debates about what to do with the military after Saigon's fall. With the economy in free fall and worsening food shortages, there were those that believed that the several million-man army was absorbing a disproportional amount of resources from the government, while people were going hungry. This faction of the party, known as the Economists, were led by the chairman of the National Assembly, Trong Chin, and wanted to demobilize a large number of troops and use some of the remaining ones to engage in economically productive work. They were opposed by the Metal Eaters, led by General Vo Nguyen Giap, who wanted to maintain a large standing army to defend Vietnam from Cambodia and Chinese encroachment. A compromise would be reached, which mostly satiated the needs of the military. A small number of units were demobilized, while increasing spending on military equipment, while also using a small number of army units for economic activities. But conscription for males between the ages of 18 and 25 was continued. However, due to the process being locally controlled, men as young as 16 and as old as 55 were often conscripted when local cadres couldn't reach their quotas. And the service length, which was only supposed to last 2 years, would more often than not last 5 or more. Southerners would also be subject to conscription, but depending on whether their families were classified as revolutionaries or puppets, they would serve in different capacities. These military and administrative reforms would go in tandem with economic reforms, which would seek to put the manufacturing and agricultural sectors of the South under the same management as that of the North, which had been subject to central planning since the 1950s. Like the rest of the communist world, North Vietnam would have their own X-year plans. Most famously, you had the 5-year plans of the Soviet Union, which most socialist countries tried to emulate, but sometimes that was too ambitious for a new regime, especially former colonies. So North Vietnam would begin implementing 3-year plans in 1955, which saw them target increased production, initially at much higher rates such as 119%, which would later be modified down to 50%. Hanoi implemented their first 5-year plan in 1960, which was seen as an utter failure across the board in all categories, and due to the escalation of the war with the South, no new plans were initiated until 1976. The second 5-year plan was announced by Secretary General Lee Duan at the Fourth Party Congress in December 1976. This plan was initially intended to be introduced in 1975, and to just encompass the North. But after Saigon's unexpectedly rapid fall, its announcement was delayed and the details retooled to incorporate the South, with it placing a greater emphasis on agricultural production due to growing food shortages. Part of this plan was the introduction of the New Economic Zones. The New Economic Zones were areas of undeveloped jungle where prisoners released from the re-education camps would be sent to and expected to build new farming communities. This, like many other policies, was intended to increase food production, especially after they disincentivized farmers from producing. Mekong Delta farmers believe government takeover of their land is inevitable and have responded by growing only enough to meet compulsory sales to the state and the need of their families. In these circumstances, Hanoi stands little chance of boosting southern grain output enough to offset the annual shortfall. Neighboring Cambodia had implemented a similar policy, but unlike Vietnam's plan, which only resettled volunteers and former prisoners, Pol Pot had forced thousands of city dwellers into the jungles. By the fall of 1978, Vietnam's government had resettled 1.5 million people to these communities, but many of them would secretly make their way back to the cities, and none of these communities would ever produce an agricultural surplus. The goals for the second 5-year plan were quite ambitious, under the presumption that southern economic output would remain the same under communist management. But a large number of these former business owners, many of them ethnic Chinese, would flee the country, leaving the central planners in Hanoi to put army officers or party cadres in charge of operations they had no experience with, which resulted in drastically reduced output, worsening the production decline that already came from the lack of personal incentives. The country would become dependent on foreign aid from fellow communist countries, as well as sympathetic Western ones. Output goals under the current 5-year plan and the rapid development of efficient integrated economy are becoming less and less attainable. In particular, targets for gains in gross national product averaging 15% annually and for achieving food self-sufficiency by 1980 are now well out of reach. The fall of South Vietnam would have dramatic implications for Vietnam's international relations. During the war, Southeast Asia received a large portion of international attention and foreign aid, but with the war's end, the amount of outside money and resources flowing in suddenly collapsed. And the Sino-Soviet split, which had emerged in the early 60s, continued to widen, and with Vietnam no longer fighting a foreign occupation, the Soviets and Chinese were now looking to make Vietnam pick a side. But there were early attempts at reconciliation with the US, in hopes of balancing away from China and the USSR. During the 1976 campaign, Carter had said he would recognize the new Vietnamese government, and as a show of good faith, he withdrew US objections to Vietnam joining the UN. US officials visited Hanoi to negotiate the return of the remains of US soldiers, which gave Carter a positive signal about potential relations with the Socialist Republic. I hope this is a preview of the possibility of normalizing relationships with Vietnam. If they don't insist on reparations and don't castigate us publicly, I think we can accept some reasonable accounting for the MIAs. However, Hanoi would end up demanding $3 billion in reparations, which the US State Department was already disinclined to accept the offer, and the option was taken out of their hands by Congress, who passed a law forbidding the transference of any money from the US federal government to the Vietnamese government directly or indirectly through international institutions. But a year later, in September of 1978, Hanoi expressed a willingness to drop the demand for reparations. But by this time, Vietnam had grown much closer to the Soviet Union, while also increasing tensions with Cambodia. All the while, the Carter administration was preparing to formally establish diplomatic relations with Beijing. Any attempt at normalizing relations with the US during the Cold War were crushed when Hanoi signed a treaty of friendship and mutual defense with Moscow in November. Just as China and Vietnam had a pre-colonial history of conflict, so did Vietnam and Cambodia. And in fact, French intervention had prevented Cambodia from being conquered by Vietnam. Of course, the French then also resolved a territorial dispute between the two in Vietnam's favor. And independent Cambodia would continue to claim this territory, including the regime of Pol Pot. And from the moment the Khmer Rouge took control of Cambodia, Pol Pot would arm raids across the border into Vietnam. Because of this, Cambodia would be Hanoi's primary foreign policy concern in the years following unification. The Khmer Rouge and Hanoi were never on friendly terms, despite the international community assuming they were. North Vietnam hoped that they could control Pol Pot through the roughly 5,000 Khmer Rouge fighters that had been trained in Vietnam. But after taking power, Pol Pot had them massacred. Vietnam responded to this with a quick invasion of the Savay Rieng province, hoping it would trigger a coup against Pol Pot, which failed to materialize. The People's Army of Vietnam had been present in Laos since the 1960s, and their presence grew throughout the 70s and 80s, taking revenge against the Hmong peoples who had sided with the US against North Vietnam. Hanoi would reach out diplomatically to Thailand, but a coup in 1976 brought the anti-communist Thanin Kravichin to power, which delayed recognition until he was deposed in another coup in 1977. In these talks, Vietnam promised to not support the Communist Party of Thailand, while they also abstained from aiding communists in Malaysia and the Philippines. For Vietnam's part, anti-Hanoi rebels were operating out of northern Thailand, and the Communist Party of Thailand was perceived by Hanoi as being pro-China, so having another pro-China communist country in the region would only make war against Cambodia more difficult. Since taking power, Pol Pot tightened relations between Cambodia and China. He was also fighting anti-Khmer rebels, who had bases in Vietnam which Hanoi had been supporting and giving protection to. Large Cambodian refugee communities also existed in Thailand and Laos, who were loosely organized as the United Front for the National Salvation of Kampuchea, led by Heng Samrim. On top of this, the policies of Pol Pot devastated the economy of Cambodia, resulting in their own famines, which created even more refugees, who then reported to foreign journalists about the Khmer Rouge fomenting nationalist fervor against Vietnam. With arms from China, Pol Pot upped the rate and intensity of raids into the Mekong Delta, which the People's Army wasn't able to stop. In February 1978, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Vietnam voted to invade Cambodia, hoping this plan would get the Soviets to provide more aid to Vietnam. The Soviet Union would help Hanoi not only with arms, but by also increasing its troop presence along its border with China, which forced the People's Liberation Army to redeploy forces to the north. On Christmas Day 1978, the People's Army of Vietnam invaded Cambodia, using the Blooming Lotus strategy developed by General Van Tien Dung. 150,000 Vietnamese soldiers alongside 50,000 anti-Khmer Cambodians crossed the border and quickly made their way to the Cambodian capital, and then spread out in every direction, linking up with Salvation Front fighters in Thailand and Laos. Pol Pot and his aides fled the capital on January 7, 1979, with the remnants of his forces fleeing to the Cardamom Mountains. The Cambodian communists continued their destruction as they retreated from the People's Army, looting the cities and burning down granaries, thus worsening the famine that was already in place. The People's Army would occupy Cambodia for a decade, fighting a Chinese-backed Khmer insurgency. However, the Vietnamese government officially declared the war over in 1982, after having set up a new government and military under the leadership of Salvation Front leader Heng Samrin. To celebrate this victory, cities and local communities would hold celebratory parades welcoming soldiers home. However, a large segment of the troops that had been sent into Cambodia were classified as volunteers, which meant their presence in Cambodia were not officially counted as part of the total troop count in the country. Additionally, Hanoi kept a tight control over the media, successfully keeping this war, along with the war against the Hmong and Laos, a secret from civilians. Living conditions are austere and hard. Daily life is full of hardships. There are nutritional deficiencies, a shortage of vegetables. There is malaria and the constant search for medical plants to treat it. Many flies and mosquitoes, many misunderstandings between the friendly people and our troops. There was now a new Cambodian government in exile operating out of China, led by Pol Pot and Prince Norodom Sihanouk, the latter of whom would seek asylum in the US in January 1979. And there would be a fight in the UN over which Cambodian government to recognize, with Beijing backing Pol Pot and Moscow backing Samrin. Choosing between these two regimes was not the sort of decision which on its face seemed to matter much to the United States. Both claimants had fought against the United States only a few years earlier. One regime, sponsored by Hanoi, was imposed by external force and would undoubtedly conduct itself with ruthlessness. The other, headed by the notorious Pol Pot, had earned a unique place in the annals of terror. The invasion of Cambodia exacerbated tensions between Vietnam and China, but these tensions had been growing for quite some time. Aside from their pre-colonial conflict, in 1974, over a year before the fall of Saigon, China would occupy the Paracel Islands. On top of this, the treatment of the ethnically Chinese Viet Hoa also angered China. After the Christmas Day invasion, China sent a stern warning to Hanoi to pull its troops out, which was followed up by China building up its troops along the border with Vietnam. Because Li Duan believed Deng Xiaoping was just saber-rattling, he was taken by surprise when the People's Liberation Army invaded Vietnam on February 17, 1979. The US officially normalized relations with China on January 1, 1979, which was followed up by a meeting between President Carter and Deng Xiaoping on the 29th. Deng told Carter about his plans to invade Vietnam, which Carter tried to talk him out of. China had expressed concern about the growing ties between Vietnam and the USSR after their friendship treaty, and hoped the US could pressure Vietnam out of invading Cambodia, as well as preventing the Soviets from obtaining basing rights in Vietnam. In what China called a pedagogical war, the PLA penetrated the border provinces of Vietnam and captured numerous regional cities. But around the time the Soviet troops had begun to build up along its northern border, China declared its operation over on March 5, 1979, and began pulling back, fully pulling out by March 16th. During the invasion, ethnic Chinese were rounded up and placed into camps out of fear that they would become a fifth column. And similar to the occupation of Cambodia, this conflict would continue for another decade, with sporadic border crossings and thousands of mortars and artillery shells fired, with thousands more soldiers dying. Vietnamese forces would also conduct raids across the border into Thailand to attack Khmer rebel camps, which would usually trigger punitive raids by China. Vietnam would finally pull its soldiers out of Laos in 1988 and out of Cambodia in 1989. Something to keep in mind here is that basically every country involved in this conflict was suffering from food shortages, and their manufacturings were operating at abysmally low levels. Despite aid from the Soviets, the Vietnamese economy was still faltering, with Soviet experts telling their Vietnamese clients that their factories were running at only a third of their capacity. When the Soviets are lecturing you about how inefficient your economy is, you know you messed up. And it was during the war with Cambodia and China that Vietnam began its stealth economic liberalization. In August 1979, the Party Central Committee began to allow state-owned enterprises to sell off excess production, as well as allowing farmers to sell off any rice produced in excess of their quota for a profit. Officials in Saigon and Cholan even asked the remaining Viet Hoa to reopen their food businesses. And in what should be a surprise to nobody with a 12th grade understanding of economics, food production rapidly increased, and thus famine began to subside. For context of how bad it really was, Vietnam,
welcome to the rice fields, motherfucker,
had been importing 15% of its rice from the Soviet Union. When an Asian country has to import rice from a European country, you know something's gone wrong. After the Sixth Party Congress in 1986, the Southerners were allowed to engage in a limited level of private enterprise. And when a famine hit North Vietnam in 1988, the South evaded it, with its population still having a memory of how a market economy functions. And despite Vietnam's secondary schools and universities still teaching Marxist-Leninism, the party leaders acknowledged the necessity of allowing private enterprise. Le Duan had ruled a united Vietnam uncontested since 1975, but in 1986 he finally died, which opened a vacuum for a new generation of Vietnamese leaders to take power, so long as power was retained within the party. The leadership of the party would fall to Nguyen Van Linh, who had been one of the officials to allow private enterprise in Saigon during the famine, and led the party to allow limited free enterprise in the South. Under his leadership, official party papers would openly discuss the potential defeat of the Soviet Union, with Foreign Minister Nguyen Co Thach publishing an article advocating opening relations with the West. There would be a brief halt in economic liberalization after the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, fearing it could lead to the Communist Party losing power in Vietnam. This would lead to greater political repression in Vietnam, which was followed by rapprochement with China. Van Linh would reach out to China in the spring of 1990. Much of the world had temporarily broken ties with China after the Tiananmen Square massacre the year before, which left Beijing in need of friends. There was a debate within the party over whether to open relations with China, as advocated by Van Linh, or to open relations with the US, as advocated by Co Thach, with Van Linh winning the initial debate. The two communist parties met and negotiated a settlement in Cambodia, which resulted in the resumption of relations between China and Vietnam in 1991. Along with the expulsion of Thach from the Politburo in order to appease the Chinese. That same year saw Soviet aid cut in half, which resulted in Vietnam having to cut the size of its military in half, resulting in over 750,000 men becoming unemployed. And this would see the informal resumption of economic liberalization, with the unemployed starting up roadside businesses selling tea, soup, and haircuts. The treaty with China also allowed Chinese goods to cross the border, which not only brought Chinese manufactured goods into the burgeoning Vietnamese economy, but also food, which further alleviated the food shortages. Opening up trade with China was good, but keeping your economy closed off to the largest economy in the world is not a long-term strategy for growth and prosperity. But the Americans had their own hang-ups with Vietnam to deal with. The Vietnam War politically traumatized American policymakers and politicians, especially in the realm of foreign policy. Every potential interaction abroad became the beginning of another Vietnam. In retrospect, legitimate questions can be raised about our involvement in the war. Had our civilian and military leaders made a sufficient analysis of the conditions there? Had they stopped to consider that our world commitments might already be too great? And did they have a clear idea of what their military objectives were? The answer to these questions is probably no. The Democratic Party would take the lesson that all foreign military activity was unwise and distracted Democratic administrations from implementing progressive economic policies. Republicans would take the lesson that military intervention should be avoided unless you can guarantee World War II levels of public support and utilize an overwhelming level of force. And for the generation that grew up with the war or fought in it, every subsequent conflict became a relitigation of Vietnam. The Reagan administration would be the first to try and challenge the popular wisdom on Vietnam syndrome, but his own cabinet would be divided on it. You had figures such as Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, who fully embraced the right's post-war consensus that armed conflict must be avoided if it would be politically detrimental to the administration. The war in Vietnam, without limited objectives and yet our unlimited willingness to commit troops, reinforced my belief, which I expressed many times when I was Secretary of Defense, that it was a very terrible mistake for a government to commit soldiers to battle without any intention of supporting them sufficiently to enable them to win, and indeed without any intention to win. In contrast, Reagan's Secretary of State, George Shultz, would be the leading advocate for what we now call a neoconservative foreign policy. He wanted to use military force to resolve conflicts that politics had failed to. And in 1985, after a brief debate within the White House, Secretary Shultz would commemorate the 10th anniversary of the fall of Saigon with a speech to the staff of the State Department. The 10th anniversary of the fall of Indochina is an occasion for all of us as a nation to reflect on the meaning of that experience. As the fierce emotions of that time subside, perhaps our country has a better chance now of assessing the war and its impact. This is not merely a historical exercise. Our understanding of the past affects our conduct in the present, and thus, in part, determines our future. Events since 1975 shed light on the past. This horror was precisely what we were trying to prevent. Whatever mistakes in how the war was fought, whatever one's view of the strategic rationale for our intervention, the morality of our effort must now be clear. Those Americans who served, or who grieve for their loved ones lost or missing, can hold their heads high. Our sacrifice was in service of noble ideals, to save innocent people from brutal tyranny. The Iraqi invasion of Kuwait would see the Bush administration put the nation to the test on whether or not Vietnam Syndrome had truly been conquered. And in 1991, it seemingly had. Combined with the fall of communism in Europe, there was a mood for putting the Cold War behind us, which opened the possibility of normalizing relations with Vietnam. The last remaining hang-up was the niggling issue of unaccounted-for prisoners of war and missing-in-action GIs in Vietnam. Since 1973, there was a concern that some Americans had been left behind in Vietnam, and although some politicians wrote these people off as conspiracists and cranks, these concerns were more widespread than anyone had realized. And so, in 1993, Massachusetts Senator and Vietnam veteran John Kerry was appointed the head of a committee to investigate the issue, along with fellow veteran and Arizona Senator John McCain. Their committee dug into every report of alleged last sightings of missing soldiers, interviewed last known witnesses, and made several trips to Vietnam to investigate alleged burial sites. After 2 years of work, the committee concluded that there were no more living POWs or remains of them left or traceable in Vietnam. And so in 1995, against opposition from conservatives and most Vietnam vets, President Clinton, who had avoided service in Southeast Asia thanks to educational deferments, normalized relations with Vietnam.
Today, I am announcing the normalization of diplomatic relationships with Vietnam. Today, they and many other veterans support the normalization of relations, giving the opportunity to Vietnam to fully join the community of nations and being true to what they fought for so many years ago.
Just a quick reminder, if you haven't filled out the 2024 Casual Historian Audience Survey, it is linked down in the description below. It really does help me decide on what topics to make videos about, as well as what potential business opportunities you guys might be open to me exploring. And if you haven't seen it yet, then check out my previous video about the First Lebanon War back in the 90s. Or you might even be interested in this video I made last year about the history of Vietnam Syndrome. If you enjoyed this video, then you should give it a like and leave a comment down below telling me about what kinds of topics you would like me to cover in future videos. And if you really enjoyed the video, then you should just hit that subscribe button already and maybe click the bell icon to turn on notifications if you're feeling spicy. Thanks for watching the video, and I will see you all next time.